The Montana blizzard screamed through the valley, echoing the agony in Evan Wright's soul. 3 years after his brother fell in combat due to a fatal command, Evan, a former Navy SEAL, still carried the crushing weight of survivor's guilt. But fate had a twist waiting in the storm. On his way to the grave, 2 desperate puppies blocked his truck, leading him to a ravine where their mother lay dying, shielding them with her last breath. To save this shattered family, Evan faces an impossible choice. He must ally with the former commander responsible for his brother's death. From bitterness to redemption, this journey reveals that sometimes the rescuer is the one who truly needs saving. It is a story of loyalty, forgiveness, and healing broken wings. Subscribe now to witness how a miracle in the snow changed everything. The Montana sky was a bruised shade of violet, spitting ice onto Highway 287, while the bitter wind howled through the pines, a funeral dirge for a world frozen in time that matched the chill inside the truck's cab. Evan Wright gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the leather. A man carved from granite and regret, standing 6'3" with the broad, tense shoulders of a former Navy SEAL, though his posture now carried an invisible burden heavier than any rucksack he had ever humped through the mountains of Kandahar. His jawline was sharp and strictly clean-shaven, a rigid adherence to military discipline he maintained even years after discharge, as if shaving away the stubble could somehow scour away the chaotic memories of the ambush. He wore his old Navy working uniform Type 3 trousers, the digital woodland camouflage pattern of green, tan, and black standing out starkly against the gray upholstery, a ritualistic garb he donned only when visiting mile marker 47 or the military cemetery where his younger brother lay buried. Today marked exactly 3 years since the operation, the day the order was given, and the day Ethan bled out in his arms, leaving Evan with a survivor's guilt that had hollowed him out until he was little more than a ghost haunting his own life. The silence in the truck was suffocating, filled only by the rhythmic thwack hiss of the wipers fighting the accumulating snow, a metronome counting down the moments of a life Evan often felt he didn't deserve to keep living. As the truck rounded a treacherous icy bend known locally as the Devil's Elbow, Evan's combat instincts flared before his conscious mind could even register the shapes in the road. He slammed on the brakes, the heavy tires skidding precariously on black ice before shuddering to a halt mere feet from 2 small trembling figures blocking the lane. They were puppies, German shepherd mixes, looking absurdly small and fragile against the backdrop of the blizzard. The larger one, who would later be known as Ash, had a coat of dark charcoal and black with a distinct gray patch over his left eye. He stood his ground with a defiant bark, his tiny chest puffed out in a brave imitation of a guard dog, refusing to yield to the multi-ton metal beast bearing down on him. Beside him was a smaller, frailer sibling, Echo, whose fur was a pale, sandy beige, shivering violently and pressing close to the brother's flank, looking at the truck with terror but refusing to abandon his post. Evan exhaled a curse, the adrenaline leaving a metallic taste in his mouth, and opened the door, the biting wind instantly assaulting his face as he stepped out into the knee-deep powder. "Move," he commanded, his voice raspy from disuse, expecting the wild animals to scatter into the tree line at the sound of a human voice, but they did not flinch. Instead of running, the dark puppy, Ash, lunged forward with a growl that was more desperate than threatening, clamping his small jaws onto the hem of Evan's camouflage trousers and tugging backward with frantic urgency. The smaller one, Echo, retreated to the edge of the asphalt where the road dropped off into a steep, snowy ravine, looking back at Evan with wide, intelligent eyes that held a pleading sorrow far too deep for such a young creature. Evan's irritation evaporated, replaced by a sudden, chilling realization that this wasn't play and it wasn't aggression. It was a distress signal, a tactical maneuver executed by infants. Ignoring the freezing slush seeping into his boots, Evan followed the puppies to the guardrail, peering down into the twilight gloom of the embankment where the pristine white snow was disturbed by a violent slide and the dark stain of disturbed earth. 20 feet down, half buried in a drift, lay a large German shepherd female, a magnificent creature even in ruin, her coat a rich tapestry of black and tan, though now matted with ice and dark crimson blood. A fresh trail of broken branches suggested she had been struck by a vehicle, likely a pickup truck based on the heavy tire tracks that hadn't bothered to stop, and thrown over the edge. She wasn't dead, but she was close. Her rear legs twisted at unnatural angles that evidenced a shattered pelvis, and her breathing came in shallow, ragged hitches that puffed weak clouds of steam into the freezing air. Yet, despite the agony that must have been tearing her apart, she had curled her large body around a small, hollowed-out depression in the snow, shielding the lingering warmth of the spot where her puppies had been huddling, remaining a mother first and a dying animal second. Evan slid down the embankment, disregarding the sharp rocks tearing at his hands, and when he reached her, the mother dog, Luna, lifted her heavy head. She didn't growl or try to bite. She simply looked at him with amber eyes that were deep, soulful, and filled not with fear, but with a crushing resignation and a silent plea for her offspring. In that gaze, time fractured, and Evan wasn't on a Montana roadside anymore. He was back in the dust and heat of the desert, looking into Ethan's eyes as the light faded from them. Eyes that held that same look of acceptance and concern for the team, for his brother, rather than for himself. The guilt that had calcified around Evan's heart for 3 years cracked under the weight of that stare, and he saw the same spirit of sacrifice in this broken animal that he had lost in his brother. The puppies tumbled down the slope, whining and licking their mother's muzzle, and she gave a low, painful whimper, nudging them toward Evan in a clear transfer of command. "Save them," her eyes said. "I am done, but save them." Evan dropped to his knees in the snow, tears hot and foreign on his frozen cheeks, and made a choice that defied logic but fed his starving soul. He carefully scooped his arms under the massive, broken weight of the shepherd, ignoring the strain in his back. "Not today," he whispered, his voice cracking with a fierce, newfound purpose. "Nobody else dies today." Evan Wright shifted instantly from grieving brother to combat medic, a transition drilled into his neural pathways through years of high-stakes repetition. Ignoring the biting wind that threatened to freeze the sweat on his brow, he stripped off his heavy field jacket, laying it on the snow to serve as a makeshift stretcher for the injured German shepherd. With hands that were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins, he performed a rapid trauma assessment on Luna, noting the pale gums indicating shock and the terrifying displacement of her hips. He couldn't fix the bones here, but he could preserve heat. He wrapped the jacket tight around her shivering frame, lifting the 80-pound animal with a grunt of exertion that strained the muscles of his lower back, carefully sliding her onto the back seat of his truck where the heater was already blasting. Ash and Echo scrambled in after her, the smaller, beige puppy wheezing audibly, a wet, rattling sound in his chest that Evan recognized immediately as fluid in the lungs. He slammed the door, sealing them in a steel cocoon against the storm, and vaulted into the driver's seat, his boot heavy on the accelerator as the truck roared back onto the treacherous asphalt of Highway 287. The drive was a blur of whiteout conditions and sheer will. Evan drove with aggressive precision, his eyes scanning the void for the lights of the nearest town, his mind forcing a disconnect between the whimpering dog in the back seat and the memory of the helicopter ride out of Kandahar, where silence had been the loudest sound in the world. He skidded into the parking lot of the Timberline Veterinary Clinic, a small log cabin structure with a glowing emergency sign buzzing in the twilight. He didn't wait for assistance. He kicked the clinic door open, carrying Luna in his arms like a fallen comrade, shouting for help with a voice that commanded attention. Dr. Sarah Bennett emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on a towel, her presence immediately cutting through the chaos. She was a woman in her late 30s with a mane of unruly auburn hair tied back in a utilitarian messy bun, escaped strands framing a face that was kind but etched with the fatigue of long shifts. Her eyes, a sharp, intelligent hazel behind wire-rimmed glasses, widened only for a fraction of a second at the sight of the blood-covered giant in her lobby before narrowing in professional focus. She wore scrubs that were clean but worn, and her movements were efficient, wasting no energy as she directed Evan to a metal examination table. "Get her up here. Watch her head," she ordered, her voice calm and authoritative, a tone Evan respected instinctively. As she began checking Luna's vitals, her hands moved with a dexterity that reminded Evan of a bomb technician defusing a live wire. Severe hypothermia, probable pelvic fractures, internal bleeding, she diagnosed rapidly, shouting orders to a vet tech who had materialized to take the puppies. The little one, the beige male, he's cyanotic, oxygen, stat. I need to get this mother into surgery now or she won't make the hour. The doors to the operating room swung shut, severing Evan from the immediate action and leaving him stranded in the sudden antiseptic silence of the waiting area. The adrenaline dump hit him all at once. He sank into a plastic chair, his breath hitching in his chest, and looked down at his hands. They were coated in Luna's blood, dark, sticky, and cooling rapidly in the climate-controlled room. But as he stared, the fluorescent lights seemed to flicker and dim, and the blood on his palms shifted in hue, becoming brighter, arterial red. The smell of wet dog and disinfectant vanished, replaced by the copper tang of blood and the acrid scent of cordite and burning sand. He wasn't in a clinic in Montana anymore. He was back in the dust, pressing his hands into the gaping wound in Ethan's chest, feeling the life pump out of his little brother while the radio crackled with useless chatter. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, his vision tunneling until all he could see was the red on his skin, the physical manifestation of his failure. I couldn't save him. I can't save anyone. The panic attack was a rising tide, drowning him, making the air in the room too thin to breathe. Then a sensation grounded him, a rough, wet warmth against his knuckles. Evan gasped, the hallucination shattering like glass as he looked down to see Ash, the dark gray puppy, sitting at his feet. The vet tech had apparently let him loose, or he had escaped his kennel. The puppy whined, a high-pitched sound of confusion, and licked the blood from Evan's hand again, his small tail thumping tentatively against the linoleum floor. There was no judgment in the animal's eyes, only a raw, instinctual need for connection. Evan reached out with a trembling hand, burying his fingers in the thick fur behind Ash's ears, using the tactile sensation of the coarse hair and the rapid beat of the puppy's heart to anchor himself back in the present. He wasn't in the desert. He was here. He was still in the fight. Hours bled into the night until the door finally opened, and Dr. Sarah Bennett stepped out, looking exhausted, pulling her surgical cap off. "She made it," Sarah said softly, leaning against the door frame, her hazel eyes softening as she looked at Evan and the sleeping puppy at his feet. "We stopped the bleeding and stabilized the hips. It's going to be a long road, and the next 12 hours are critical, but she's a fighter." Evan stood up, his legs stiff, wiping the last of the dried blood onto his camo pants. "I'm staying," he stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the ghosts lingering in his posture, and simply nodded. "I figured you might. There's a blanket in the supply closet." Evan didn't go home. He lay on the hard floor beside the incubator, where Echo struggled for breath and Luna slept the sleep of the drugged, guarding them through the darkness just as he wished he could have guarded his brother. The recovery of the German Shepherd, whom Evan had named Luna, defied medical expectations in a way that seemed almost supernatural, a testament to a will to survive that burned brighter than the fluorescent lights of the clinic. Within 48 hours, she was no longer the broken thing dying in the snow. She was standing, albeit shakily, on 3 legs, her amber eyes tracking every movement in the room with a predator's intelligence, her fractured pelvis held together by pins and sheer stubbornness. Ash, the bold gray puppy, had taken to sleeping directly on top of Evan's boots whenever he sat down, while little Echo was finally off oxygen, though his breathing remained raspy and fragile. However, the miracle of their survival brought with it the crushing reality of logistics. On the third morning, Dr. Sarah Bennett pulled Evan into her small, cluttered office, her expression apologetic as she slid a clipboard across the desk. "Evan, I've waived my surgical fees," she began gently, her fingers toying with a pen, "but the medication, the hardware for her hips, the round-the-clock care for the pup's pneumonia, the cost is already in the thousands and she needs months of rehab." Evan stared at the invoice, the numbers blurring. His disability pension was meager, and the farm was a money pit. He couldn't afford this. Yet the thought of abandoning the family he had pulled from the ice felt like abandoning Ethan all over again. Sarah saw the desperation in his eyes and offered a lifeline. "There is a local organization, the Rocky Mountain Canine Rescue. They handle specialized cases like this. I called them. Their director is coming to assess Luna." The bell above the clinic door chimed an hour later, signaling an arrival that would shatter the fragile peace Evan had begun to build. The man who walked in was a physical, imposing figure, bringing with him a gust of cold air and an aura of heavy, silent authority. Daniel Torres was in his late 40s, a man carved from the same rough stone as Evan, but weathered by a decade more of erosion. He stood just over 6 feet with a stocky, powerful build that had thickened with age but lost none of its lethality. His hair was a stark salt and pepper, cut in a severe regulation fade that old military habits refused to let grow out, and his face was dominated by a square, stubborn jaw and deep-set dark eyes that looked like they had stared into the sun for too long and been burned blind to joy. A jagged, faded scar ran from his left ear down to his jawline, a souvenir from a past life. He wore a heavy canvas jacket with the Rescue Center's logo, but underneath his posture was rigid, his hands resting naturally where a rifle sling would have been. Evan, who had been kneeling to check on Luna, stood up to greet the benefactor, but as the man turned and the overhead light caught the plastic name tag clipped to his jacket, D. Torres, Director, the world stopped. The air left the room. The sound of barking dogs and ringing phones faded into a high-pitched tinnitus whine. Evan wasn't looking at a dog rescuer. He was looking at the ghost of the command tent in the Arghandab Valley. He was looking at then-Lieutenant Torres, the officer who had given the go order for the raid on the compound in Sector 4. The intel was bad, the entry was a trap, and it was the order that sent Ethan and 3 others into a kill box they never walked out of. The recognition hit Evan like a physical blow to the chest, instantly igniting a rage so pure and white-hot it nearly blinded him. "You!" Evan snarled, the word tearing out of his throat like a growl, his hands curling into fists at his sides, his body dropping instinctively into a combat stance. Daniel Torres stopped mid-stride, his eyes widening as they locked onto Evan's face, the recognition dawning slower but with equal devastation. He saw the family resemblance, the same eyes, the same jawline as the boy he had sent to his death 3 years ago. "Right," Daniel whispered, his voice gravelly and stunned. "Evan Wright? Ethan's brother?" "Get out," Evan commanded, stepping between Daniel and the dogs, his voice shaking with the effort to not launch himself across the room. "You don't get to be here. You don't get to touch them." Sarah, sensing the sudden violence in the air, stepped out from behind the counter, alarmed. "Evan, what is going on?" Evan didn't look at her. His eyes were drilled into Daniel. "This is the man who killed my brother. This is the officer who sent him into a blind ambush on bad intel." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Daniel didn't deny it. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses about the fog of war or faulty satellite imagery. He simply stood there, his shoulders slumping as if the invisible rucksack he carried had just doubled in weight. The arrogance of rank was gone. In its place was a hollow, broken acceptance. "I know," Daniel said softly, not breaking eye contact, accepting Evan's hatred as his due penance. "I live with that every day, son. There isn't an hour I don't see their faces." "Don't you call me son," Evan spat, stepping forward, his chest heaving. "You retired. You got to come home. Ethan came home in a box." Daniel took a breath, his gaze shifting momentarily to Luna, who was watching the confrontation with intense, guarding eyes, and then back to Evan. "I can't change the past, right? I tried to drink it away, tried to eat a bullet twice, but I'm still here. Now I try to save things that others throw away. That's all I have left." He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for a business card. "The clinic called me about a shepherd and 2 pups. My center is at capacity. We have no kennels left. But we have funding. We have donors." Daniel placed the card on the counter, his hand trembling slightly. A tremor of nerve damage or guilt, Evan couldn't tell. "Here's the deal. You foster them. You have the land. I saw your address on the file. You keep them. You rehab them. My center pays every dime of the vet bills, the food, the training equipment, everything." Evan looked at the card, then at Luna. The mother dog was leaning against his leg now, sensing his distress, offering her support despite her own pain. If he kicked Daniel out, he couldn't afford to save them. If he took the deal, he had to be in league with the man he hated most in the world. It was a deal with the devil, but the devil was offering salvation for the innocent. Evan looked back at Daniel, his eyes cold and hard as flint. "I'm not doing this for you," Evan said, his voice deadly quiet. "I'm doing it because they deserve better than to die because of bad luck, something you wouldn't understand." Daniel nodded, swallowing the insult without flinching. "I accept that," Daniel replied, turning to leave, his silhouette framed against the snowy glass of the door. "We'll send the check tomorrow. Keep them safe, right? Do the job I couldn't do." The farmhouse sat on 40 acres of neglect at the end of a gravel road, a physical manifestation of Evan Wright's internal state. The paint was peeling in long gray strips like dead skin. The porch sagged under the weight of 3 winters of uncleared snow, and the inside was a mausoleum of silence where dust motes danced in the stagnant air. For 3 years, the only sounds had been the humming of the refrigerator and the occasional scream of Evan waking from a nightmare. But the arrival of the Taurus pack, as Evan bitterly referred to them in his head, shattered that silence with the force of a grenade. The living room, once sparse and military neat, was now a chaotic obstacle course of shredded newspapers, squeaky toys provided by the rescue center, and the pervasive, earthy scent of animal musk and puppy formula. Ash, the dark-coated male with the gray patch over his eye, had appointed himself the household's drill sergeant. At 500 hours sharp, he would launch his growing body onto Evan's bed, digging sharp puppy claws into the duvet and nipping at Evan's ears until the ex-seal groaned and surrendered to the day. There was no sleeping in, no lying in the dark staring at the ceiling wishing to fade away. Ash demanded movement, demanded the back door be opened, demanded life continue. Evan would stumble into the kitchen, his bare feet cold on the linoleum, grumbling threats that had no heat behind them, while Ash performed a clumsy victory dance around his ankles, tripping him up in a display of unadulterated joy that was annoyingly infectious. Echo, however, was a different frequency entirely. The beige puppy remained small and fragile, his lungs still recovering from the pneumonia that had nearly claimed him. He spent his days in a heated crate Evan had set up near the wood stove, wrapped in soft blankets, watching the room with large, intelligent eyes that seemed too old for his age. Every 4 hours, Evan had to mix a specialized high-calorie milk replacer and feed Echo with a bottle, a delicate task that required the large, calloused hands of a man trained to dismantle weapons to become incredibly gentle. Evan would sit in his worn leather armchair, cradling the tiny animal against his chest, feeling the weak but steady rhythm of Echo's heart against his own, murmuring soft encouragement that he would never have spoken to a human being. "Drink up, little bit. You got this. Fight for it," he would whisper, and in those quiet moments, the armor Evan wore so tightly around his soul would loosen just enough to let a little light in. It was in these moments of vulnerability that Luna, the matriarch, would watch him most closely. Despite her shattered pelvis and the heavy bandages restricting her movement, she refused to stay in her designated recovery bed. She dragged herself to the rug beside Evan's chair, positioning herself between him and the front door, her head resting on her paws but her ears swiveling like radar. Dishes. One night, when the terrors came, the familiar dream of the ambush, the sand, the blood, Evan woke up gasping, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm, only to find Luna standing over him, balancing on 3 legs, her cold nose pressed firmly against his neck, grounding him, pulling him back from the precipice of memory. She didn't offer pity. She offered solidarity, a fellow soldier standing watch while he recovered. Dr. Sarah Bennett became a fixture in this new, chaotic ecosystem, her visits ostensibly to check on Luna's surgical incisions and listen to Echo's lungs, though she often stayed long after the medical exams were finished. She brought casseroles that she claimed were leftovers, but were clearly made fresh, and her presence brought a warmth to the drafty house that the wood stove couldn't match. Sarah was observant, her hazel eyes missing nothing, not the way Evan's hands shook slightly when he talked about the past, nor the way he had begun to shave with more care and wear clean shirts when he knew she was coming. One rainy Tuesday, as they sat on the porch watching Ash chase a blowing leaf while Luna watched from the doorway with intense, frustrated focus, Sarah swirled the coffee in her mug and broke the comfortable silence. "She hates being an invalid, you know," Sarah said, nodding toward Luna. "She's a working line shepherd, Evan. Look at her focus. She's cataloging everything. The wind, the birds, the squirrel on the fence. She's not a pet. She's an operator without a mission." Evan looked at the dog, really seeing her frustration for the first time. He recognized the look because he saw it in the mirror every day, the restlessness of a weapon left to rust in a garden shed. "She's broken," Evan replied gruffly, "just like the rest of us here." Sarah reached out, her hand covering his on the railing, her touch electric and grounding. "Broken things heal, Evan. But they heal faster when they have a purpose. She needs a job, and maybe you do too." Spring arrived in Montana not with a whisper, but with a violent thaw, turning the frozen earth into a thick, clinging mud that coated everything at Evan's farm. It had been 2 months since Daniel Torres had first walked into the clinic, and, true to his word, the checks from the Rocky Mountain Canine Rescue had arrived like clockwork, covering every surgery, every therapy session, and every bag of premium kibble. When Daniel returned to the property in late April to assess their investment, the tension between him and Evan was still a physical weight, thick enough to choke on. Daniel stood by the fence line, his weathered face unreadable behind dark aviator sunglasses, watching Luna move across the paddock. The German shepherd, now fully healed but for a slight rhythmic hitch in her gait, was no longer the victim. She was a missile of focus, fixated entirely on the rubber ball Evan held in his hand. When Evan threw it, she didn't just run. She exploded forward, her drive to work overriding any lingering pain, retrieving the object and returning it with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Daniel nodded slowly, removing his glasses to reveal those dark, haunted eyes that had seen too much war. "She's not a pet, right?" Daniel called out, his voice gravelly and carrying over the wind. "You can't keep her as a house dog. She's got a high prey drive, high intelligence, and 0 quit. If you don't give her a job, she'll tear your house down or she'll go crazy." He walked closer, his boots sinking into the mud. "She's SAR material, search and rescue, specifically trailing and cadaver work. She wants to hunt. Let's teach her to hunt the living." The challenge hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown down between 2 men who shared nothing but a dead brother and a living war. Evan looked at Luna, vibrating with energy, and then at Daniel. "I don't know the first thing about SAR protocols," Evan admitted, his guard still up. Daniel cracked a rare, faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, but you know operational discipline. You know grid searches, you know how to read terrain. I know the dog work. We do this together, or we waste her potential." And so, an uneasy alliance was forged in the mud of the paddock. The training began the next morning, transforming the neglected farm into a tactical training ground. Evan applied the rigorous discipline of Bud S training to the pack. He built agility courses from fallen timber and old tires, teaching the dogs to navigate unstable surfaces. Ash, the dark-coated male, was a natural athlete. He possessed a brute, fearless strength, throwing his 80-pound frame over 6-foot walls and biting into the tug toys with a ferocity that made Evan grin. Ash was the muscle, the breacher, the one who would kick down the door. But it was Echo, the runt, who surprised them both. Physically, he couldn't keep up with his brother or mother. He tired easily, and his legs were shorter. Yet, during the hide-and-seek drills where Evan would hide a toy, or later himself, in the dense woods, Ash would run frantically in circles, barking at trees, while Echo would stand perfectly still. The beige puppy would close his eyes, lift his nose to the wind, and inhale deep, complex drafts of air, analyzing the scent profile like a sommelier tasting wine. He ignored the visual distractions and followed the invisible highway of scent molecules, finding Evan in the most impossible hiding spots with eerie precision. "He's the sniper," Daniel observed one afternoon, watching Echo methodically work a scent cone. "He doesn't run and gun. He waits, he calculates, and he executes. He's got the best nose I've seen in 10 years. The weeks turned into months of grueling physical labor. The shared exhaustion became a solvent that slowly dissolved the walls between Evan and Daniel. One evening, after a particularly brutal session where they had run a 3-mile track through dense underbrush, both men sat on the tailgate of Daniel's truck, passing a canteen of water back and forth, the dogs panting at their feet. The sun was setting, painting the sky in the same bruised purple as the day they met, and the silence stretched out, no longer hostile but heavy with unspoken things. "I check the intel reports every night," Daniel said suddenly, staring at his boots. He didn't have to specify which intel. "I go over the maps, the satellite imagery from that day. I try to find the variable I missed. The shadow that was actually a gunman. The heat signature I ignored." Evan stiffened, the old anger flaring, but it lacked the heat it once had. He looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw the scar on his jaw, the tremor in his hand, the gray in his hair that hadn't been there 3 years ago. He realized Daniel was still in that command tent, trapping himself in a prison of his own making, torturing himself with what-ifs, just as Evan tortured himself with survivor's guilt. "There was no intel," Evan said quietly, his voice rough. "It was a trap, Daniel. You didn't miss anything because there was nothing to see. They were waiting for us." It was the first time he had used the man's first name. Daniel looked up, his eyes wet, the stoic mask cracking for a fraction of a second. "I sent him there, Evan. I have to carry that." Evan reached down and rested a hand on Luna's head, feeling her solid, living warmth. "You are carrying it," Evan replied. "You're carrying it by saving them. We're both just trying to balance the ledger." In that moment, the hatred that had fueled Evan for 3 years finally ran out of gas, replaced by a somber, shared understanding that they were both just casualties trying to find a way home. The anniversary of the worst day of Evan Wright's life arrived not with a whimper, but with a roar, the Montana winter unleashing a blizzard that turned the world into a seamless, suffocating white sheet of ice and wind. It was exactly 1 year since Evan had pulled a dying wolf dog from the snow, and 4 years since Ethan had died in the desert, but this time, Evan wasn't drinking alone in the dark. He was in his kitchen, checking gear bags with military precision, the room warm with the smell of the coffee Dr. Sarah Bennett was brewing. Sarah, now a permanent fixture in his life, wore a heavy wool sweater and tactical pants, her auburn hair braided tight against her scalp, her hazel eyes scanning a topographic map spread on the table. The domestic quiet was shattered by the radio on Evan's belt, a direct line to Daniel Torres. "Right, we have a code black," Daniel's voice crackled, distorted by static but unmistakable in its urgency. "School bus, Route 287. It went over the rail. Same curve, Evan. The devil's elbow." The blood drained from Evan's face, the cyclical cruelty of fate hitting him like a physical blow. It was the exact spot where he had found Luna, the exact spot where his brother's ghost seemed to linger. "We are rolling," Evan replied, his voice flat and deadly calm. He looked at the pack. Luna was already standing by the door, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure and human emotion. Ash, now a 90-pound behemoth of muscle and protective instinct, paced nervously. Echo, smaller, lighter, and trembling slightly in the draft, watched Evan with intense, knowing eyes. The drive to the ravine was a nightmare of fishtailing tires and zero visibility, but Evan drove with the cold certainty of a man who had made peace with death. When they arrived, the scene was chaotic. Local volunteer firefighters were struggling to set anchors in the frozen ground, their shouts swallowed by the wind. Daniel Torres was already there, acting as the incident commander. He looked older in the harsh emergency lights, the scar on his jaw standing out purple against his pale skin, but he moved with the decisive authority that had once commanded SEAL teams. "The bus is down there, maybe 50 yards, Daniel shouted over the gale, pointing into the abyss. "We got most of the kids up, but the roster's off. One missing, 7-year-old boy. We can't find tracks in this powder." Evan nodded, clipping a lead to Luna's vest. "Search," he commanded. Luna didn't hesitate. She plunged over the edge, her body surfing the snow, her nose working furiously to cut through the smell of diesel and exhaust to find the scent of fear and human life. Evan followed, rappelling down the icy slope, with Ash and Echo close behind, Ash using his brute strength to plow a path, Echo hopping lightly in his brother's wake. At the crash site, the bus was a crumpled tin can against a pine tree. Luna cleared the vehicle quickly. Empty. She circled the wreck, whining, then abruptly turned her head toward a dense cluster of jagged limestone rocks further down the ravine, an area too steep and narrow for the firefighters to navigate safely. She barked once, sharp, authoritative. "She has a line," Evan radioed up to Daniel. "Going deeper." The terrain turned into a labyrinth of fissures and fallen timber. Ash struggled here, his large size becoming a liability as he got snagged on branches, whining in frustration as he tried to force his way through. Evan had to leave him on a stay command. "Echo, up," Evan signaled. The smaller dog, light-footed and agile, scrambled over the scree. Echo didn't have Ash's power or Luna's command presence, but he had a gift. He slithered into a narrow crevice between two boulders, a space no human or large dog could fit. Seconds later, a high-pitched, rhythmic barking echoed from deep within the rock formation. It was the alert signal. Evan scrambled to the opening, shining his flashlight into the dark. 10 feet down, wedged in a small cavern where he had likely crawled for shelter, was the boy, unconscious and blue with cold. "I have visual," Evan screamed into the radio. "He's alive, but critical. I can't reach him." He looked at Echo, who was licking the boy's face, whining. Then he looked at Luna. "Luna, go," he ordered, pointing into the hole. It was a tight squeeze, but the mother dog forced herself down, whining as the rock scraped her flanks. She curled her warm, furry body around the freezing child, acting as a living thermal blanket, her tongue cleaning the ice from his face. Up above, Daniel Torres had rigged a high-angle rope system. He rappelled down, landing beside Evan in a shower of snow. The two men, the commander who gave the order and the soldier who blamed him, worked in perfect wordless synchronization. They built a mechanical advantage pulley system, their hands moving over the carabiners with identical muscle memory. "On 3, Daniel grunted, bracing his boots against the rock. "Heave." Together, they hauled the basket up, inch by agonizing inch, with Luna refusing to leave the boy's side until he was lifted clear. When the boy was finally loaded into the helicopter, the rotor wash whipping the snow into a frenzy, Evan stood on the edge of the ravine, exhausted. Daniel walked up beside him, clapping a heavy hand on his shoulder. "We got him, Evan," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "He's going home." Evan looked at the bus, then at the curve of the road where he had lost everything, and then at the boy flying away safe. He looked at Luna, Ash, and Echo, his team, his family, wagging their tails in the snow. The ledger wasn't balanced. It never would be, but for the first time in 4 years the red ink didn't look like blood. It looked like life. "Yeah," Evan replied, looking Daniel in the eye and offering a hand that didn't shake. "We got him." The snow did not leave the Bitterroot Mountains all at once. It retreated slowly, surrendering to the relentless persistence of the sun, revealing patches of vibrant green earth that had been suffocated for months, a transformation that mirrored the internal landscape of the people standing in the quiet solitude of the Veterans' Cemetery. It was May, the air filled with the scent of damp soil and blooming wildflowers, a stark contrast to the biting gray chill that had opened this story. Evan Wright stood before the white marble headstone that bore the name Ethan Wright, but for the first time in 4 years he did not feel the crushing weight of the tombstone pressing against his own chest. He was no longer the hollowed-out ghost haunting his own life. His face was fuller, tanned from long days of training in the sun, and the haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. Beside him stood Dr. Sarah Bennett, her hand resting naturally in the crook of his arm, her auburn hair loose and catching the sunlight, looking at Evan not with concern, but with the comfortable intimacy of a partner who had weathered the storm and stayed for the rebuilding. Flanking them were the dogs, the architects of this resurrection. Luna sat at attention, her coat glossy and thick, wearing an orange vest that read, "Search and Rescue," a badge of office she wore with regal pride. Ash, now a hulking mass of muscle and loyalty, lay in the grass, chewing on a stick with happy abandon, while Echo sat perfectly still, his head cocked, watching a butterfly land on the headstone. Daniel Torres stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. The former lieutenant looked different. The deep lines of stress around his eyes had softened, and while the scar on his jaw remained a testament to the violence of their shared past, he no longer carried his body like a man anticipating a blow. He held something in his hand, his fingers trembling slightly, not from trauma, but from emotion. He knelt in the grass, leveling himself with the name on the stone. "I carried this for 20 years, Daniel whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears. He placed a heavy, dull metal object on the marble lip of the grave. His Silver Star medal, the highest honor he had received, a symbol of valor that had felt like a lie every day since the ambush. "I can't bring you back, soldier, but I promise you, I'm using every day I have left to make it right. We're saving them, Ethan. We're saving them all." He touched the cold stone once, a gesture of final apology and gratitude, and when he stood up, he seemed physically lighter, as if the metal had weighed 1,000 pounds. Evan watched this ritual in silence, and a profound realization settled over him like a warm blanket. He looked at Luna, who leaned against his leg, and then at the puppies. Ethan hadn't just died. In some cosmic, inexplicable way, his memory had guided Evan to that curve in the road. He had sent these broken, dying creatures to intercept his brother before he drove off the edge of his own despair. Life at the farm transformed in the months that followed. The silence of the empty house was replaced by the chaotic, beautiful noise of a family. Sarah officially moved in during June, bringing with her boxes of books, the smell of vanilla candles, and a sense of permanence that Evan had never thought he would have again. The farm became the satellite training ground for Daniel's rescue center. Evan and Luna became the star team of the region, deployed for lost hikers and disaster relief, their bond telepathic and absolute. Ash found his calling as well. Too boisterous for delicate work, he was trained as a facility protection dog for the rescue center, patrolling the fences with a fierce, joyful dedication, ensuring no harm ever came to the vulnerable animals inside. And Echo, the runt, the one who had nearly died of pneumonia, found the most surprising path of all. His calm demeanor and uncanny ability to sense emotional shifts made him a perfect candidate for therapy work. Twice a week, Evan took Echo to the VA hospital in town. There, the small beige dog would bypass the loud greetings and walk straight to the most withdrawn veteran in the room, resting his head on their knee, offering a silent, non-judgmental comfort that no human therapist could replicate. On a crisp morning in early autumn, Evan stood on his porch with a mug of coffee, watching the sunrise burn the mist off the mountains. Luna trotted up to him, nudging his hand for a scratch behind the ears. He looked out at the pasture where Sarah was throwing a frisbee for Ash, her laughter ringing clear in the morning air. He looked at the scar on his own soul and found that while it was still there, it was no longer an open wound. It was just a mark of where he had been, a map of how he had survived. He knelt down, burying his face in Luna's fur, inhaling the scent of pine and dog, and whispered a thank you to the empty air, to the brother who was gone, and to the wolf dog who had stayed. He knew the grief would always be a passenger in his car, but he was driving now. He wasn't alone. He had his pack. And for the first time in a very long time, the road ahead looked clear. Evan's journey teaches us that miracles rarely appear as lightning bolts from the sky. Often they arrive as quiet opportunities to love when we feel we have nothing left to give. God did not erase the tragedy of the past, but he answered a silent prayer by orchestrating a meeting at a frozen curve in the road, proving that even in our darkest winters we are never truly forsaken. The healing Evan found suggests that perhaps the miracle you are waiting for is not a change in your circumstances, but a chance to be the answer to someone else's cry for help. If this story of redemption touched your spirit, please share it to spread light to those walking through their own valleys. Subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below about the blessings you have found in unexpected places. May God bless you and your loved ones, and may He always guide you home.